Hello everybody, Raspberry Barrel here, and today we'll be reading the final part to the Dipper, the Father of Stars Biographies by MewniHistorian on DeviantArt. If you haven't seen the previous parts, please go check those out first. Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background. Let's begin. In Gravenock, Nebula had an official coronation, the youngest ruler yet to be coronated, and would be for a long time. Dipper put on a brave face for the kingdom, as did Nebula. Despite only being a child, she was the new face of the kingdom, and made several public appearances with a fake smile. One of the few times Dipper saw Nebula genuinely smiling was when she was bottle-feeding Luna, and the other times were when she was with Selene and Rain. Dipper did his best to shield his grandchildren from the horrors of the war. The war was intense, as the Shadow Emperor used a perverted version of Mo's enchanted magic, making his enslaved soldiers and his magic made shadow creatures even more difficult to defeat. As such, Dipper read the spell from Mo's chapter and used it to enhance the soldiers before they sailed off to war. But by fall that year, the Shadow Emperor had sent his forces to attack the coast of the Dragonfly Kingdom, and some kind of infection spread through, enslaving others into the forces. The Dragonfly Queen, Wyvern, was an excellent mage, but had no way to help those infected other than imprisoning them. The Dragonfly and Denial forces returned to their continent rebellion to defend their homelands. Cleo was very worried about her family over there. As the year 861 BS began, Dipper recruited forces from Spiderbite Kingdom, his former son-in-law's family, to add to the attacking forces of the Shadow Emperor, as most of their forces were keeping guard on the forest of certain death. But to avenge Jab, they agreed and sent them to fight. Dipper's nephew, King Stephen Lazuli, was a fighter, but also a powerful mage, trying to find the best way to defeat the shadow infections and the shadow monsters. After a couple years of fighting, things hadn't really moved forward until Stephen found a way to remove the dark magic from the infected, the pure magic of the magic sanctuary. As Stephen's dad was a butterfly, he knew about the sanctuary and experimented with the pure magic and found a single drop was enough to cure the infected. By 858 BS, they were able to cure the captured infected, but they couldn't risk taking the pure magic out on the battlefield. Dipper's son Alexander used a spell which created a light sword, a sword that destroys the shadow monsters, and Alexander took great pleasure in destroying those creatures, earning him his Slayer title. Orbita earned her Fierce title by how brutal she was during battle. That and everyday aggression. With ways to cure the infected and destroy the shadow monsters, Dipper really felt hopeful they could win this war. However, in Norvath of 857 BS, a shadow monster, one never seen before, entered the castle and killed many staff and warriors, and the Phoenix Queen and King. Its fangs were so potent that not even the flame could revive the king. Nebula forged magic blade and jabbed it into the creature's throat and slashed it, killing the creature. Dipper was slightly terrified of his granddaughter, seeing her smile at the creature's death. Dipper continued to oversee the kingdom as Nebula entered teenagehood. The Shadow War was still intense, but they were finally gaining ground in West Luciolus. Through Reckon, they learned the Shadow Emperor had other dark mages working with him, which made sense given the sheer amount of dark magic being conjured. Though they gained ground in the enemy territory, they were still a long way from winning the war. But Dipper had faith they could win. He remembered reading about his great-grandmother Mo's trying times during Mew Dependence 180 years ago, and remembered her trying times with the monsters, how she never gave up and eventually won. Dipper saw the determination in his son and daughter, and he knew that eventually they would win. One way or another, they would defeat the Shadow Emperor and free Mewni of his existence, and also avenge Hemra. Dipper planning during the Shadow War. The year of 857 BS continued to grow difficult as Nebula's 14th birthday rolled around, and what was to be a day of happiness and joy was only full of tears and sorrow. The heir's 14th is most important today to the princess's life as a princess, but Nebula was already queen, and that night Dipper had to do damage control as Nebula had a mental breakdown that nearly destroyed the dining room, and Dipper suffered a grave injury. But Dipper was healed by Nebula's herself, who caused the damage in the first place. She apologized 1,000 times, but Dipper forgave her even before the first time. That night, Dipper slept beside his granddaughter, comforting her, which sent him on his own emotional journey as it brought back memories of his daughter Hemra when she was little. And to make matters worse, that night Cleo passed away at 89 years old, and it wasn't of natural causes. The funeral was held soon after, and Dipper and Nebula laid Cleo next to their daughter Hemra. Apparently heavy rainfall from a couple weeks prior caused an overflow from a toxic lake into a river near the capital that provided drinking water to the city. Due to her age, Cleo was more susceptible. Her and many other elders passed away after claims of discomfort in the days leading up to their deaths, and Dipper felt the same. Well, he used to before Nebula healed him the week before. Likely it also healed the poisoning. Dipper and Glossaryck helped Nebula devise a way to help heal her people, and it wasn't just the old who were sick anymore. It took a couple days, but Nebula devised an incantation that healed the sick people and purged their river of contamination. On Cork 9th, the night sky filled with clouds, and Dipper watched as the people of the city bathed in the magic rain as Nebula used her magic to heal them all. Dipper was more than proud of her. She healed their city, saved them. She connected the rainfall to death spikes of past, how there was a spike in the death rates after a monster storm like weeks before, and now they know better. They were able to put a barrier around the lake, so it couldn't contaminate their waters again. Since then, Dipper saw a change in his granddaughter, how she was more attentive to her people and began to attend meetings with Dipper. Dipper couldn't help but see a resemblance with Nebula and Hemra, how passionate the two were, and believed that she would make as great a queen as she was. She was also taking her spells more seriously, coming to him for advice and asking him if the stories in his chapter and her mother's were true. The next year, Dipper began taking Nebula into the war meetings, feeling she should have some say. Despite being a teenager, Dipper saw such a growth in her in the past year. His services as regent were required less and less. What he wanted most of all was to fight alongside his own children, but he was a couple years off of 90, and his warrior days were behind him, or so he thought. That year, 856 BS, in the summer, Nebula devised a spell, an enchantment that would allow him to fight. Dipper had accumulated a large amount of muscle throughout his life, and still retained much of that, but the enchantment helped restore his strength and speed, and even some of his color, making him feel younger and battle-ready. After hugging his granddaughter, he left on a ship for deployment, and when he got there, Dipper wasted no time, filled with bloodlust and revenge for his daughter, for his granddaughters. With him there, his son and daughter, Alexander and Orbita, were able to go back home, to be parents themselves to their daughters. There he found his brother Leo in a tent, coordinating battle plans, and Dipper hugged him so tight he could hear his spine pop. Leo's son Stephen was incredibly close with Hemra. The two moved the Lazuli kingdom to the coast of the west and East Luciolus, and Lazuli army had been fighting hard to reclaim their new home. Dipper fought hard to end this war and to avenge his daughter and son-in-law. Dipper and Nebula at Cleo's funeral. After months of fighting, the former queen had a one-on-one with the Shadow Emperor. On the spring equinox, he turned the palace that was being built for the Phoenix family into a place of evil and enslaved hundreds, both human and monster. This monster, decades ago, Dipper fought a woman of unimaginable power, and even in his advanced years, this Shadow Emperor was nothing compared to the mother of dark magic. The Shadow Emperor was strong, but he was no match for the might of the queen, even a former one. Dipper was filled with so much anger he never considered killing before, but this man, he took lives from so many people. He created a light spear, and when he had an opening, he drove it through the Shadow Emperor's heart, avenging his daughter and so many others. However, in that moment, a geyser of darkness shot up and the Shadow Emperor laughed. Outside of the captured city, darkness began to swirl around it. Dipper summoned his wings and flew up high, hearing his laughter. When he got high enough, he saw the shadow created a dome over the entire city, but he was able to escape before the darkness closed up. And then there was a blinding darkness, and Dipper passed out. When he awoke, there was nothing, absolutely nothing around him. Dipper looked around and saw absolutely nothing. The land was completely cleared. There were no people, buildings, only plant life remained. There wasn't even any markings Where the buildings used to be, all traces gone. Soldiers searched, but they couldn't find anything. The entire Shadow Empire disappeared. It seems the Shadow Emperor cursed this land in his final act, and Dipper could not have felt worse about it. Whatever curse the Shadow Emperor used, it was more powerful than anything, and not even the combined power of a couple dozen mages could undo what was done. Dipper blamed himself for what happened, that if he didn't kill the Shadow Emperor, then all those people that were banished would have lived. The land was left uncleared, dedicated to those who were both in the city when it was lost and the soldiers who died fighting in the Shadow War. Notes: while this is terrible, we know it didn't last long. 1,000 years after this, in the time of my grandmother Festivia's early reign, the Shadow Emperor returned with his empire. My grandmother didn't fight at first, distracting her people with parties, but something clicked in her after, and she destroyed the Shadow Emperor once and for all, finally avenging not just our royal ancestors, Hemra and Jab, but also the ancestors of her, our people who fought during the war, and of the other kingdoms as well. For more on this, see her chapter. Dipper returned home in the summer. The year was 855 BS, and despite his personal feelings, he was welcomed home as a hero. When he got to the castle, Nebula announced her engagement to Rain Phoenix. His brothers Storm and Thunder went to West Luciolus to rebuild the lands they claimed. His son Alexander was also expecting a son in a couple of months, and Dipper was just excited for more grandkids. That fall, the wedding of Nebula and Rain commenced. The kingdom was filled with more love and happiness than it had been in over a decade. The fact they hadn't celebrated this much since the birth of Nebula herself. His granddaughter Luna was the flower girl, throwing the same kind of flowers her mother always wore, a Mazark buttercup. In a way, it made it feel like Hemra was here. Dipper really felt like it was over, that things could be good again. For his granddaughters and his people, happy the soldiers returned home to their families. He was a little wary about letting Rain and Nebula share the same room, but they did sleep in different beds, most of the time, feeling the same fatherly protection for her as he did for her mother. But as the next year rolled around, the peace did not last long. Dipper stabs the Shadow Emperor. All his life, Dipper knew about monsters, even encountered some, but they never posed a threat, likely due to the last war over 130 years ago when his grandmother, grandfather, and great-uncle cast a spell that wiped out the monster army. But now the monsters have gotten bolder. In the spring of 854 BS, monsters raided the small villages on the edges of the Forest of Certain Death in the Butterfly and Sputterbite kingdoms. There were a few fatalities on these raids, but given the number of them and forces used, it could have been worse. Soon word was received monsters on their continents were attacking Mewni villages, and most of the armies were recovering from the Shadow Wars. Queen Nebula called a meeting of the Farfilian kingdoms, and they formed the first Monster War Council. Dipper and others were present, deciding whether or not to go to war or not, and they decided not to go to war yet. But precautions were put in place to keep the monsters out, and that only seemed to aggravate things. That year, Luna decided to go into the warrior training to protect her kingdom in the future, and Dipper was very proud of her for that choice. But eventually, in 850 BS, after a raid that killed Princess Widow, Nebula and Luna's cousin, war was declared on the monsters, and Nebula named Dipper as the general of the Mewni forces, a force made from the armies of the four kingdoms. Dipper might have been in his 90s, but he might as well have been in his 40s. He was well respected by the young warriors, not just as a former queen, but as a general. He was a strategist and a fighter. Though Dipper never killed himself, he had no problem giving the order to use lethal forces. One might see this as a contradiction to his actions when he faced the Mother of Dark Magic, but in fairness, she never killed anyone, and the Shadow Emperor and these monsters they had killed, and the monsters will continue to kill, and were a threat to all of Mewni. Many of the battles took place around the Forest of Certain Death, though some did sneak into the Johansen and Butterfly kingdoms, but Dipper's daughter Orbita was also a commander of the at-home Johansen forces, and she wasn't the fierce for nothing. She was in full support of her niece, Nebula, His son Alexander was quite the warrior as well, something Dipper did not expect from him, given how sweet he was, but a lot changed when Hemmer was killed. The other continents had monster issues too, and in 848 BS, troops from the Mewman forces went to the West Luciolas to help the Phoenix Kingdom, as they were still fragile. The Lasley Kingdom was divided by the Lapis Sea, and it was between the Phoenix and Firefly Kingdoms, so it offered support to those when needed, as they had few monster problems. The Denial Kingdom, though, had a beast problem, vicious creatures that took up most of their army's attention at the time, and it left the Dragonfly Kingdom alone. In summer of 847 BS, there was a distress crane sent by the Queen Wyvern Dragonfly begging for help. With the help of Hecapoo, Dipper and Nebula got there in an instant, the later willing to fight and had Romulus as muscle, but it was too late. Monsters had invaded the palace and killed Queen Wyvern, leaving her son Albion as the king. But he was missing. Given his personal blood ties to the Dragonfly family, Dipper personally led a search party for the teen. They found him in the dragon morass a couple weeks later, protected by a mother dragon. Apparently, the monsters who kidnapped Albion tried to take a dragon egg to eat it, but he fought them off it until the mother came and ate them, but spared him. The dragon was protective of Albion, and instigated they stay as the egg was hatching. Albion would have a son he named Wyvern, who would use that name as a last one for his new noble family that would govern the dragon morass, as others would develop relationships with the dragons and live there. Dipper insisted they stay at the Dragonfly Palace until proper security was placed, and the Mewman forces would come to aid the kingdom. Dipper took, leaving Albion a little rough. He was fatherless for years, and his mother was gone, plus he looked like his cousin Avazandum, who had passed away years ago. But the amount of warriors that were placed as guards were satisfying, but he kept tabs. Dipper and Albion watching a dragon hatching. In the spring of 846 BS, he returned to the base of Farfillion, and he saw a black-haired female warrior wiping away green slime off of her armor, and when he got closer he realized it was Luna. Dipper had a hard time processing this. His adult children were one thing, but she was only 16. While that was a fighting age, they never saw combat. When he confronted her about it, she said she had Nebula's blessing, saying, "I couldn't let other kids become orphans like me, not when I can fight." Dipper couldn't argue with that, but he did tell her to be careful. He stayed to keep an eye on her and saw she was a natural leader. Granted, she was a princess, but as a second-born she wasn't taught the same leader skills as a firstborn. But Luna took charge quickly, and it wasn't just because of her royal blood. But Luna's quick thinking saved lives. Dipper saw a resemblance in her and the past queens, Mo and Alexandra. Well, from their tales and warrior queens. Soon enough, Luna was giving orders to soldiers twice her age, and they took it. He was proud of her, the same as he felt with her mother, to whom she reminded him a lot of, not just their appearance, but other traits, like how Hemra rallied people to go on expeditions for her. Luna rallied soldiers to follow her into battle. When Dipper became 100 in 843 BS, he began to wind down by choice. While he was grateful Nebula gave him the strength to fight, both literally and figuratively, he wasn't needed. Nebula was running the kingdom, and Luna had pretty much taken over command of the Mewman forces. His granddaughter Hilda became Johansson Queen, no brothers, leaving Orbita to go command full-time. His granddaughter Selene married into the Spiderbite family, became queen, which was cool as she wasn't related to them, as that was Nebula and Luna's dad's side. Overall, Dipper felt he wasn't really needed anymore, and was fine with that. But there was still a war going on, and Dipper was still an active soldier, which he took pride in. In Cork of 841 BS, Dipper witnessed a spell Nebula performed, details reserved for her chapter, but it ended up breaking apart a large meteor that was predicted, and it rained fire on the forest of certain death. Soon after, the Monster King called a truce, and both armies retreated from battle, and the Mewman soldiers went home. Dipper was happy that the war was over. He found it funny that his mother avoided a war, and he had fought in two, and hoped the next generation didn't have to suffer the losses Nebula's did. In 835, Nebula gave birth to her daughter Nynx, a girl who inherited Jab's dirty blonde hair, but also had red bangs like her father. Dipper was the first outside of Nebula and Rain to hold her, and she pulled on his beard. Soon enough, Luna announced her engagement, and Nebula granted her leadership of the lands north of the capital lands the Phoenix family used to run. Dipper was later excited when Luna created knighthood, a code which warriors would live by. Titles Sir and Dame were awarded to those who earned it. Knights would protect their kingdom with honor and dignity, and only rulers and nobles could award this title. Dipper would continue to live to see the births of Asteria and Zoria, Nebula and Rain's other daughters, and the birth of Mercury, Riordan, first of the new noble Riordan family, and the daughters that followed. Dipper passed away on Norvath 62, 817 BS, at the age of 126. He passed away peacefully in his sleep. Dipper was buried by Nebula and Nynx, reuniting him with his parents, and importantly his daughter, after decades, and also his wife Cleo. Dipper was more than just a queen. He was a father to 2 generations, to astronomy, to the names of stars and constellations. He was the first of male queens, the rare times that there were no daughters and a son rules. History will never forget the legacy of Dipper, the father of stars. And that's it, everybody. That's the biography of Dipper, the father of stars, by MewniHistorian. That's it, all complete. So next up, by MewniHistorian, we have to read the biographies of Hemra. But first, we're going to return back to our other creators before we dive into her story. Thank you so much, MewniHistorian, for allowing us to read your biographies, and I hope everyone enjoyed hearing about Dipper's story. And if you want to see more, please go check out MewniHistorian's DeviantArt page. Thank you all for listening, and have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye!